This week, the United Nations General Assembly President visited Trinidad and Tobago. A few hours after landing, I had the chance to sit down with him one-on-one for an interview where we discussed many global conflicts facing the world right now. None more so than this region's biggest topic, the crisis engulfing Venezuela at the moment. We also spoke about the effects of climate change on small island states here in the Caribbean, as well as underrepresentation at the United Nations level. But first, he speaks to us about a life in diplomacy that culminated with his historic election as United Nations General Assembly President. Ambassador Dennis Francis, welcome back to Trinidad and Tobago and welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Ryan.
How does it feel to be back in Trinidad and Tobago?
It always feels great to be in Trinidad and Tobago. This time is particularly unique because I'm here in my official capacity as President of the General Assembly. So I'm excited, I'm happy to be back. I'm happy to be back among my country folk.
You spent the last year, just under a year, as President of the General Assembly. What has that experience been like for you?
Extremely long days and weekends.
Has it been the longest year of your career?
No, I think it has been the shortest actually, because the speed and intensity with which things happen. It's an extremely demanding job. Behind all of the prestige and the awe, it's a responsibility. There's no doubt that it's an honor and a privilege to occupy the role of President of the General Assembly. But it must not be overlooked that it is a responsibility and a very onerous one. And that responsibility is to the member states of the UN, who comprise the General Assembly, of which there are 193, in all of their diversity, but also to the people of the world.
How much success do you think you've had, Mr. Ambassador, in navigating the geopolitical issues of the world? And there are so many right now under the UNGA ambit.
Well, I find it difficult. Well, let me put it this way. I prefer not to measure my own success. I leave that for others to do. But to the extent that the General Assembly has been able, in large measure, to complete its work program for the year, this indicates that we have not allowed the geopolitical tensions that exist and that are rising to so dominate our consciousness that we were not able to get the work done. It's very true that we are in a unique period of time, that geopolitics has now crept into virtually everything, every discussion at the UN, but not altogether. We are still creating good outcomes at the UN. We are still able to find consensus on some issues. Last year, we had consensus on something called the BBNJ, which relates to the law of the sea. It's a difficult negotiation, but we were able to come to consensus. So all is not lost. The geopolitics is the geopolitics. They are the reality. We did not create it. The geopolitics would be the handmaiden of those countries, global players, who perhaps see things differently. They have a different concept of reality and of their relationships. But that apart, the work of the United Nations has to continue.
What would you say was your toughest assignment over the last year to deal with? There are so many on your desk today. Which one kept you up at night?
Well, that's easy. That's very easy. Two of them in particular, Ukraine and Gaza. Now, there are other conflicts, several other conflicts taking place in the world. that are equally worthy of attention and focus. But Ukraine and Gaza were different because they go to the very heart, to the very foundation of the international system. Let's take the case of Ukraine. This was a violation of the Charter. You could just as easily have torn up the Charter and thrown it away. And for the system to work, for it to maintain its integrity, members are duty bound to honor their commitments. So when we talk about violating the territorial integrity of a state being illegal in international law, that is a global standard that we expect all countries to abide by. When it does not happen, it creates very dangerous precedents, very dangerous. Because if that were to become normal and acceptable, we would end up with a system, with no system, and in chaos.
But we've sort of arrived at that point, Mr. Ambassador, in the sense that we've seen in this region Russian ships headed towards Venezuela for exercises. How concerning then is it that you yourself mentioned it, I'm glad that you said it, when you have nations breaking the very charter that they've signed on to? It now sets a precedent, and we're sort of seeing that play out over the last year and a half with Guyana and Venezuela. How concerned are you as UNGA president and as a lifelong diplomat that this could escalate in a similar way to what has happened in Eastern Europe?
Well, one hopes that it will not escalate. And I think we need to take comfort in the fact that both Venezuela and Guyana have taken their dispute to the International Court of Justice, the World Court, for adjudication. This is precisely what the UN wants to happen in the case of conflict, that an objective, qualified UN court will look at the case and come down with a judgment. This is good for problem solving. It is when that process is not followed in conflict, when countries decide to go for broke and to launch military action, that is what becomes problematic, because that sets off a chain of events that impacts all countries and all peoples, actually. People may not be aware of this, but for example, every time you go to the supermarket, you're paying for the war in Ukraine because of global food supply shortages, because the supply chains have been broken. So every time. This is why we try to avoid and we encourage countries to postpone for as long as possible getting into war, and advocate that they should sit around the table and work their differences out peacefully.
Coming up next, as the government opts to watch and wait, do you feel that governments, both past and present, have done the right thing in remaining neutral? When you look at what is happening in Venezuela this weekend and the million-man march that has taken place on both sides of the divide, it surely doesn't instill confidence in you as head of the UNGA that someone like President Nicolas Maduro will honor a decision made by the ICJ?
Well, I don't know what is in the president of Venezuela's mind, and I wouldn't attempt to. But all countries, as members of the UN, have the right, have the option to refer their disputes to the court. And we hope that that will happen. What would the alternative be? Would there be resolution? Is it anticipated that there would be resolution to the current situation in Venezuela simply by having the marches all the time? Probably not.
So how concerning is Venezuela for you, and what is happening across and the ripple effects that is having on not only Latin America, but this very small neighbor that you happen to have grown up in?
It is concerning what is taking place in Venezuela, but it's concerning from the point of view that the UN advocates always democracy, adherence to democratic traditions, and for good reason. Because legitimate governance derives from people giving their consent to be bound, their consent to be governed. And that consent is given in the form of a vote. When there are questions about the legitimacy of that vote or of the outcome of that vote, this creates problems, political problems for the system. And there's always the increased risk of social upheaval in which lives can be lost, property damage, etc., etc.
As president of the UNGA, what would you like to see, Mr. Ambassador, going forward in Venezuela for a dispute resolution?
Well, I think dispute resolution is a matter that the Venezuelan people, along with the authorities, would need to consider and come up with a credible plan for. It would not be proper for me to seek to impose or suggest any direction in which they should go. What I would like to see is a deliberate, clear-eyed effort to resolve the issue peacefully in order to avert the possibility of a wider confrontation in Venezuela. That would not be good for Venezuela, and it would not be good for the Latin American and Caribbean region or for the international system. We have got enough challenges. I believe that for this year there are already 55 conflicts raging in the world. 55. Creating a real challenge for peace and stability. Creating a real challenge for progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Because war sucks the energy out of the system, sucks the oxygen out of the system. So we do not need another situation of conflict.
You're a lifelong diplomat, Mr. Ambassador, and I'm sorry to cut you in, but I do want to ask you, given Trinidad and Tobago's precarious position that you're going to be so much aware of because you spent your life in diplomacy, this country is in a very precarious position when it comes to any decision when it comes to Venezuela, because we're geographically so close to them. They're closer to us than our own country in Tobago. Do you feel that governments, both past and present, have done the right thing in remaining neutral in the face of the issues that the Venezuelan government face?
I believe they have done the right thing. Neutrality is always a good position because particularly in a situation of domestic conflict, why should any government take a risk of being seen to be aligned with one side as opposed to the other, when the situation can be very fluid and change? So I think the neutrality position is a wise one. It's a pragmatic one. Clearly there's a problem in Venezuela. It seems now like it threatens to be a constitutional problem. There's a political problem. It seems as if it might become a constitutional problem, that's a problem for the Venezuelan people to resolve, not third parties. Not third parties. Third parties might assist and support the process of reconciliation, but the responsibility to fix it, to make it normal, so that the country can proceed on its way in a normal way, that responsibility rests squarely in the hands of the Venezuelan people and the authorities.
I want to switch to another crisis that is unfolding, Mr. Ambassador, climate change, because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I do want to make sure that we talk a lot about the impact of climate change,
Yes.
particularly on small island states, which we see you as an emergence, a representative of small island states on the biggest stage at the General Assembly. What more can the UN do to ensure that global north countries are held to both account and also meet the needs of small island states, particularly when it comes to carbon pollution?
It's an interesting question, but it presumes certain things. For example, it presumes that the UN as an institution is a player in the negotiations. The UN is not a player in the negotiations on climate change. We follow and monitor them closely. We publish reports, scientific and other reports, that indicate what the current consequences of global warming are and what days during the year are the hottest days and how that has been manifested on the ground in terms of biological activity, the effect on fisheries, for example. But the UN is not per se a player. The global north has to determine whether its position is credible given the compelling evidence that exists that climate change is getting more and more serious, its effects are more virulent, and the consequences, not just for developing countries and for small island developing states, the consequences for the entire system are dire unless urgent action is taken to reverse the trends.
I ask specifically, Mr. Ambassador, because those global north countries we've seen post-pandemic, a lot of coal mines have started back up across Europe and across Asia. So leaving it to the global north countries, as we have seen post-pandemic, has not quite. The United States right now, as much as it talks about climate change, is the world's #1 liquefied natural gas producer and seller. So the global north countries, in understanding its own responsibility, have not actually heeded that responsibility. And we've seen what happened with Hurricane Beryl over the last few months. I do want to ask you, though, given the number of conflicts before you at the UN in New York, particularly when it comes to security, do you feel that have you done the amount of work in climate change that you would have liked to have gotten done over the last year, coming from a small island state that is being affected by the impact of climate change?
Well, now let's keep two things in context. There's a specially dedicated organization in the UN system where climate change issues are negotiated. That's called the United Nations Conference, UNFCCC.
Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Right. They will have their meeting, COP, in November of this year in Abu Dhabi, I believe it is.
This one will be in Baku.
In Baku, that's correct. Abu Dhabi was last year, in Baku. And that's the forum at which all major policy developments, improvements, those decisions will be taken there. What we do in the General Assembly is to look at the big picture. We look contextually at the political framework within which these issues have to be addressed and the implications for all of us and for that political framework of postponing action. You're quite right. The developed North need to confront issues of climate change frontally. In many cases, they have made commitments to provide resources for climate finance. They set up the Green Climate Fund. They've agreed to now the loss and damage, set up a fund for loss and damage. There have been some commitments to those funds. But by and large, funding for climate change has been disappointed.
Yeah.
Disappointing. More needs to be done, and needs to be done more urgently, because the fact of the matter is the situation is getting worse. And the longer we differ, the more costly it becomes. The more costly it becomes, not just in terms of money, but in terms of impact. But you were asking earlier about what can be done, what can the UN do to help to fix the problem. Well, one of the things that we've done, one of the key things that we've done, and this has been an initiative of the current president, is to focus on the issue of sea level rise in the context of climate change. Because there are parts of the world where small island states, concerned for their survival regarding this existential threat of sea level rise, have entered into arrangements with third countries to relocate their populations in the event of subjugation, in the event that they're submerged. Sea level rise is a reality. And I took the initiative that since this is a matter affecting all small island developing states and low-lying communities and countries, it ought to be a matter brought to the attention of the General Assembly. So for the first time on September 25th this year, there will be a high-level meeting of the General Assembly, attended primarily by heads of state and government, to consider the issue of sea level rise in the context of climate change. And to give direction to the Assembly in terms of what needs to be done in order to address the risks and challenges and to support small countries in coping with this existential threat.
Up next, we discuss underrepresentation at the UN.
Small countries have awakened to the fact that they've become more confident.
I do want to stick in a couple more very quick questions, Mr. Ambassador, before we end. You talk about small countries. For many decades, small countries, the representation, collaboration, engagement, whichever word you'd like to use, at the UN level has been a concern for small countries, especially standing up to global superpowers. Do you feel that the representation and the collaboration from the UN, particularly when it comes to smaller nations being represented or underrepresented as it might be at the UN level, is something that has gotten better and is getting better or needs to get better?
I don't think that it has gotten better. I think in my certain knowledge, Trinidad and Tobago has for many, many years played a dynamic and often leading role in the United Nations on a number of issues. For example, in the negotiation of the Constitution of the Seas, the law of the sea. I will call a name that I'm sure you're not familiar with, but there is no one who has been through the Foreign Ministry in the last 40 or 50 years who does not know this name, Lennox Fitzroy Ballard, a former distinguished permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a brilliant international lawyer who wrote several parts of that treaty. And without him, the treaty would have collapsed. Not only that, we've done it as well with the Arms Trade Treaty. Trinidad and Tobago was in the vanguard of pressing for the Arms Trade Treaty. You would be aware that former Prime Minister, come President Arthur Napoleon Robinson, was among that small group of professionals who grandfathered the Statute of Rome, the International Criminal Court, which was not at all popular in the early days. Now it's a functioning court. Thank God it exists, because those who think that they can commit the most egregious crimes against humanity have been brought before that court and will be brought before the court. These are things that a small country like Trinidad and Tobago has done historically. I don't think it is that it is getting better. I think what is happening is small countries have awakened to the fact that they've become more confident. They've become a whole lot more confident. They understand representation now better and are willing to use their voice and their numbers in order to effect change. And they've been doing this masterfully and to good effect in the system.
Someone like yourself deserves a lot of credit as well for that, given your life in diplomacy even before you became UNGA president. Mr. Ambassador, I have to ask you, you've spent your life in diplomacy. This is the pinnacle of your life's work in diplomacy. I know that you may not have a lot of time to reflect on the achievement and the accomplishment of being UNGA president, given your hectic schedule over the last year, but when you do, what does that feel like for someone like you? Coming from a small country, dot or dust on the map, and rising to UNGA president?
Well, it gives me a sense of pride, and it gives me a sense of fulfillment that I would have made a contribution, however modest, to trying to make the world a better place. Most people believe that the UN is about war, and it is about war. There's no doubt about that. It's about war because it's about peace, primarily. And the opposite of peace is war. But the UN is more than about war. The UN is about people, the quality of their lives, giving them hope, lifting them up. Right now, even as we speak, there are 900 million people globally living in abject poverty. No prospects for change. Another 900 million living in hunger. And maybe another 900 million or more food insecure. We have to do something to help those people. It is unacceptable in 2024 that when one man can purchase a company for 41 billion United States dollars, that we've not been able to meaningfully address poverty, hunger, marginalization in the international system. And we can, with the requisite political will, we can and must. Because we must give people hope so that they can live lives of dignity and have their human rights respected. And if I have been able to make a contribution to that, I would feel very fulfilled.
Mr. Ambassador, you will visit your alma mater, Woodbrook
Yes.
Secondary School, on this trip.
Yes.
For every other student that might be watching you on this program, rising out of Woodbrook Secondary School to becoming the UNGA president, what would you say to the young people who might have ambitions similar to you?
Pursue it. I did not know when I was in Woodbrook Secondary that I would one day sit as president of the General Assembly. I had the ambition of being successful, though it wasn't clear to me in what form that success would come. But I had the ambition and the discipline to do the work. It does not drop out of the sky. You have to have the discipline, you have to do the work. The work creates the results. It prepares you for the moment when the opportunity might come your way. So I would advise them to be diligent, do the work. Do not be in a hurry to become an adult. Enjoy your childhood and your youth. It will be gone fast enough. Use the time to develop the skills. Read a lot. And when I say read, I'm not talking social media. Read the newspapers, because so much of what is available on social media is destructive. It's misinformation and disinformation that will misguide you, cause you to make poor decisions that could affect your lives and other people's lives. Read the newspaper. Go up on the internet. Read foreign newspapers if you can. Be outward looking in your vision. There's a big world out there with many, many opportunities. We need to become more outward in our vision, because that is one of the things that will help this country to grow and to develop.
Ambassador Dennis Francis, happy to have you home. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.